Wants a single. Gets there in time. It's the fastest 100 by any player in Test match history on debut. 85 balls for a magnificent 100.
Hello and welcome to episode 43 of Radio Cricket. That's 43, the same number of popes that Sachin Tendulkar will have outlasted by the time he retires. I'm Nishant Joshi, and if you believe recent news, Virat Kohli is my twin brother. According to growing rumours, we were separated at birth. We are in fact the same age, but as of yet, nobody knows which one of us is the evil one. I suppose time will tell on that one. I'm joined by the man who was once voted as the best cricket satirist in post-communist Eastern Europe. Former Soviet Union leader Nikita Khrushchev used to be big into taking the mickey out of the 1960s Australian side. He was a big fan of the Red Bull. It is James Marsh.
Yes, hello Nishant. Yes, I mean, I'm personally a big fan of Gorbachev's stuff on the KP scandal, but that's very kind of you to say. But anyway, how are you? What have you been up to this week?
Well, James, I had a lovely few days last week. I made an appearance on Indian TV as a guest to talk about the Australian homework gate, which was a bit weird for me as it was totally last minute, and when the anchor asked me about the Aussies, my mind immediately rewinded back to our last podcast, and I tried to filter every joke to see whether or not it was repeatable on live television. And James, the thoughts that go through your mind when you're on live TV are quite terrifying. I mean, the stuff that just goes into your head. I mean, should I say that Steve Smith reminds me of Ralph Wiggum from The Simpsons? Do they even have Simpsons in India? Why don't they have Simpsons in India? And before I went on air, I was also not told anything whatsoever about protocol or which words I should or should not say, which meant that for an agonising moment, the thought of calling Shane Watson a grade A muffin went through my mind. See, James, they never said that I shouldn't say muffin, catastrophe, or catastrophe, in which case that television station would have been entirely at fault.
Well, indeed. Well, I must admit I was slightly confused because I did see someone who looked a lot like you, or perhaps a lot like Virat Kohli, on Indian TV this week. But he seemed a very mild-mannered, reasoned young man, speaking in very polite tones about something. Nishant, can you confirm it was actually you? And indeed, how many people do you think actually got the benefit of your wisdom?
Well, James, I don't actually even know if it was me or not, considering the number of replies that I've had saying there's a Virat Kohli lookalike on NDTV right now, tune in. I'm not sure about the ratings. Of course, India is a very big country, over 1 billion people, many of whom are cricket fans. Going by the number of death threats I've been getting in the last few days, I'd say somewhere in the region of 300 to 400 million probably saw me on TV the other day. Pope news now, and James, last week was a pretty special one for elderly white men who take responsibility for 1 billion people, as Duncan Fletcher was elected Pope. Duncan Fletcher was given a 1-year contract extension as coach of India. Now, just like the new Pope, Duncan Fletcher is in a rather ceremonial role. His job is to cover up for the failings of his own setup, and in essence, he's paid rather a lot of money for doing sweet fuckable. It is rumoured that the new Pope, that's the Argentinian Pope Francis, or the sexy Pope as he prefers to go by, is actually a big fan of cricket, which became apparent when he made his inaugural address to the Vatican Square last Wednesday evening. Speaking to a rapturous crowd that Ravi Shastri described as nearly as magnificent as the Chinnaswamy Stadium, Pope Francis said, "Let us bow our heads and pray for the needy. Let us always pray for those who have been forgotten by society. But tonight, let us make a special prayer for the Australian cricket team. Amen."
Well, indeed, Nishant. Habemus Jadejageddon it was in Mohali this week. And, well, I suppose we should talk about the Fletcher news as well first. I mean, I must say, I was personally rather disappointed to see this because I was actually trying to have a nice siesta at the time, and then all the fireworks going off over Mumbai when the 1-year extension was announced really woke me up. So I was a little bit grumpy about it. But anyway, I suppose there has been it's fair to say, a mixed reaction to this news. Gavaskar has criticised it. He said that if Fletcher had been an Indian, he wouldn't have got this extra year. He said that if you look in the past, every time an Indian coach didn't do well in a series, he was removed, he said. And I suppose we have to say Fletcher has done quite badly in more than just a series. Obviously, there was the 8-0 back-to-back losses, the failure to get out of the group stages at the World T20 tournament last year. But I suppose to Duncan's credit, he has taken these results on the chins. And looking at this series, this is the first time that India have ever won the first 3 tests of a series of 4 matches or more. So he can certainly take some solace from that. Apparently, MS Dhoni was instrumental in the decision to grant Fletcher a 1-year extension, and at times today, during India's chase of 136, it looked as if he was striving to attain similar levels of popularity amongst Indian fans. At one stage, he'd actually scored 4 off 23 balls. And of course, always in these situations, the spectre of the Dominica Test of 2011 looms large, when India were 94 for 3, chasing 180 against the West Indies, when Dhoni decided to call the match off with 15 overs left. But I think, to be fair, India were always in control here. They did chase down their target more slowly than Sehwag moves towards an exercise bike, Nishant, but a win is a win. And also, just a little stat, Dhoni has now won 7 tests as captain against Australia, which is more than any other captain. But perhaps we should move on to focus on younger blood within the Indian side, and there was an absolutely wonderful debut during this match.
Yes, James. Well, Shikhar Dhawan, or as he prefers to be known, Shikhar Bow Wow, is the 277th player to represent Indian Test cricket, and he brought up his century in just 85 balls, which is a new world record in Test. He's the 97th player to score a century on Test debut, and he is also the first man with a moustache to score a century on Test debut since Mohammad Azharuddin back in 1984. Now, this has been quite a controversial statistic. A lot of people mentioned Sourav Ganguly's effort at Lords on debut when he scored 131 against England. Personally, I feel that his moustache wasn't fully grown, so it doesn't really qualify. It was more of a Dale Steyn, Caterpillar sort of half-baked effort from Ganguly in the late 1990s. So I have to hand this one to Azharuddin and Dhawan.
Well, I think anybody who's seen our new logo on YouTube, Nishant, will appreciate that I fully understand the controversy surrounding slightly dubious caterpillar moustaches. So perhaps just moving back to Dhawan quite quickly. As you say, was the fastest ever century on debut, and he beats Dwayne Smith, the West Indian, who reached his ton in 93 balls in the 3rd test against South Africa in Cape Town in January 2004. And we actually spoke about Dhawan a couple of weeks ago when he was overlooked for the 1st test, and we wanted him to come in perhaps. And one of the things I pointed out was his wonderful ability to drive. And if you look at the way he played Doherty, the left-arm orthodox spinner, however dismissive you might be of the Australian bowler, playing against the spin, Dhawan actually scored 5 boundaries in front of square on the offside, including one absolutely majestic 6. So I think this aspect of his game, this ability to drive even against the spin, is something which is going to hold Dhawan in good stead for the rest of his hopefully very long and fruitful Test career.
Australia news now, and school's out for summer, school's out forever.
Extraordinary.
Well, James, for the first time since 1988, Australia have lost 3 consecutive tests in one series. Obviously, these are quite trying times for the Aussies, and our full sympathies are with them after their rather humble and modest period of world domination, which lasted the best part of 2 decades. So obviously, our with sympathy cards are in the post to Mickey Arthur as we speak. So of course, after the 2nd test, there was a rather interesting scandal after Mickey Arthur banned 4 of his players from playing in the 3rd test after they failed to complete what was termed as homework and what was in reality just 3 sentences which he wanted to hear. I believe those 3 sentences were all variations of, "We didn't execute our skill sets perfectly, but we'll try better in the next test." So James, what should Australia's homework be for this week?
Well, I really don't know, Nishant. Unless they can build a Test class spin attack in craft and design, I really think anything they do is futile. I think, on a slightly serious note, again, I mentioned Khawaja last week and said I thought it could be another stumbling block in his career, and it has now transpired that he's split up with his manager, who went on a rant against his own client on Australian radio, saying, I dare a young rugby league player to say, I forgot to do my homework. Hell and damnation would come down on their heads, Khawaja's agent said. But, he continued, cricket is different. You're pushing against the ocean. Professional cricketers have been taught from a young age that they are special. So I don't know if rugby league players are particular role models that cricketers should be aspiring to, but nevertheless, it is another pothole in the road of Khawaja's career, which, to be honest, has been substantially less smooth than his cover drive. If Australia were to take the Stuart Broad approach, and given all the peroxide in that changing room, you might argue that they already have, they could take the positives. And one of them would have to be that Phil Hughes scored his first run against spin in 59 balls throughout the series, and went on to make a very courageous 61. And he was actually very unlucky in the second innings. He got a stinker of a decision against Ashwin, and to be frank, there were shotguns used in bank heists which have been less sawn off than him in that particular instance. So anyway, Nishan, but apart from that, I don't know, I guess you could say Australia's seam attack actually bowled quite well with the old ball in both innings, but Nishan, there is perhaps one great encounter throughout the match that we haven't yet mentioned, the Islam versus Judaism of the sporting world. Perhaps you'd like to talk about Steve Smith and Ravi Jadeja's performances.
Well, yes, James, of course you are referring to the Federer and Nadal of Test cricket. Mohali, the third Test, India versus Australia, shall forever be known as the first ever encounter of Ravi Jadeja versus Steve Smith in Test cricket. Steve Smith with an excellent 92, batting at number 5 in his comeback to the Australian team after a prolonged absence. Interesting stat about Steve Smith is that he's now played as both a specialist Test bowler and a specialist Test batsman within the past 2 years, and he's still only 23 years old. And it's pretty remarkable the transformation that he's undergone. I mean, a couple of years ago I mentioned that Steve Smith would give up his leg spin pretty quickly and become a batter who maybe bowls just the occasional bit of filth when some filler bowling is needed. Steve Smith's technique still is a bit more Jackson Pollock than Van Gogh, but at the end of the day you can't argue with the results, and 92 coming straight into a losing side I think is a phenomenal effort from Smith, and all you have to say is fair play to him. But the more remarkable thing about Steve Smith's Test return was that he got Sachin Tendulkar out, caught it short leg, in his first ball in his return to Test cricket, which was just utterly remarkable and utterly terrifying as a prospect as well. For Steve Smith to get arguably the greatest batsman of all time out with his part-time leg spin filth is nothing short of bizarre and could well turn out to be the highlight of Smith's career. On the other hand, you have his nemesis, Ravi Jadeja. Well, I do say that they're nemesis, but I guess they just don't know it yet. Very solid performance at home, and he is turning into quite a useful cricketer for India. He gives the side balance, batting at number 7. He hasn't quite done it with the bat, but with the ball he's providing that really useful holding role. He's exceptionally accurate, and he picked up figures of 6 for 112, which are the best for India in the match. And his Test average in 4 tests so far is hovering at 21 with the ball. And that brings us to the end of another episode of Radio Cricket. But before I leave you, it would be remiss of me to not say happy birthday to the old man that is Test cricket. Test cricket turned 136 years young last week, and India versus Australia was the 2081st Test. It has had pretty tough life. Test cricket has lived through 2 world wars, a World Series, Jadejageddon, and currently the batting of Jonathan Trott. So Test cricket, you old dog, we salute you. I've been Nishant Joshi.
And I've been James Marsh. Goodbye.
I think it was a very poor performance. One of the worst things I have ever seen done on a cricket field. Good night.